As the calls for racial justice get louder throughout the world, is it time for colonial powers and slave trading countries to atone for their sins by paying reparations? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. Mobilized since the death of George Floyd, a black man killed by a white police officer in the United States, the world has witnessed a reawakening over systemic racism. Growing demands for racial justice have renewed the debate about apologies and reparations by former colonial powers and slave trading countries to make amends for their crimes and past injustices. Many countries are now grappling with their history. In France, protesters are calling for an end to discrimination against non-white descendants from former colonies. In the US, symbols of slavery and colonialism have been brought down, from statues of Confederate leaders to colonizer Christopher Columbus. The name of a former transit point for the transnational slave trade on Senegal's Goree island was changed from Europe Square to Freedom and Human Dignity Square. In Nigeria, Lagos State Assembly voted to rename all sites that still bear the names of colonial masters. But this racial reckoning is evolving into a debate over what true reconciliation looks like. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, said, quote, "Behind today's racial violence, systemic racism and discriminatory policing lies the failure to acknowledge and confront the legacy of the slave trade and colonialism. We also need to make amends for centuries of violence and discrimination, including through formal apologies, truth-telling processes, and reparations in various forms. So are former colonial powers and slave trading countries ready and willing to pay? The United States has attempted it before. Aus Haidari takes a look at previous efforts by the American government to offer reparations.
After World War II, the U.S. Congress created the Indian Claims Commission to pay compensation to any federally recognized tribe for land that had been seized by the U.S. government. The commission awarded nearly $1.3 billion, less than $1,000 for each Native American, but the government also prevented them from controlling the funds, arguing they were, quote, not competent to receive such large amounts of money. In two separate instances, the U.S. Congress compensated Japanese Americans forcibly taken from their homes during World War II and sent to internment camps. First, in 1948, when the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act offered $37 million to 26,000 claimants for personal and property loss. The second time in 1988, when Congress issued an apology and offered to pay $1.6 billion to 82,219 survivors of interned Americans of Japanese ancestry. In 2015, the city of Chicago agreed to pay $5.5 million in reparations to 57 people, nearly all African-American men, who accused the police of beating and psychologically torturing them. These cases took place between 1972 and 1991. The Chicago Police Department had been accused of torturing more than 200 innocent men during that period in order to force confession. In 2013, North Carolina became the first state in the U.S. to enact legislation to compensate survivors of a decades-long eugenics program where 7,600 people were sterilized. The victims were largely poor, disabled, or African American. State lawmakers set up a $10 million fund to compensate them. In 1994, Florida became the first U.S. state to pass a reparations law to address decades-old racist violence that state officials failed to stop. The law set aside $2 million for survivors of a 1923 massacre when a white mob that included KKK members swarmed into the largely black hamlet of Rosewood and killed at least 6 black residents. One survivor's family received reparations amounting to $3,333.33.
I'm now joined by one of the early leaders of the civil rights movement and a confidant to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, former Congressman and Mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young. Ambassador Young, much has been achieved since the civil rights movement in the United States back in the 1960s. But now, while the world is facing a pandemic, there's an upsurge of outrage about systemic racism in the U.S. and, in fact, throughout the world. How far can and should this movement for racial justice go? Where do you draw the line between what's possible and what is not?
Well, racial justice, as we defined it, was to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. We're actually seeing racism, but the real problem is poverty. And dealing with an economy that includes all of the citizens has been our challenge. One that, if we address it, we would address also the problem of race.
And the reality, as you say, the fact that there is so much poverty and those economic disparities is that there is still this legacy of segregation, of unequal access to quality education, housing, healthcare. The economic disparities and lack of opportunities are all very real for African Americans, not to mention the abuse of Native Americans as well. There are now demands, though, for compensation. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think that there's no question that we need to have some form of restorative justice. I just think that it's probably better to do like we did with Europe in the Marshall Plan. That by dealing with the problem for everybody, we dealt with the problem with a sort of no-fault analysis. We didn't blame the Germans or the Japanese. We realized that we needed to develop them and give them an equal opportunity for freedom and to be a part of the economy that is now a successful global economy. The virus is disrupting that. And we're going to have to restructure the entire global economy. And in restructuring the global economy, like a Marshall Plan for the poor of all races. And that would bring about not only justice, but it would also bring about a more successful economy. It's a win-win solution rather than a win-lose solution.
But is it a win-win solution for African Americans and other minorities who have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and the economic fallout? I mean, would the work that you and Martin Luther King Jr. and the other great figures of the civil rights era started, would it be complete without an explicit apology and financial reparation for the crimes that were committed against African Americans for centuries? I mean, isn't that an important part of racial justice?
Well, Dr. King never raised the question of reparations. He raised the question of a guaranteed annual income, that as the way the economy was mechanizing and becoming more technicalities, that there would be more and more work done by machines and less work done by humans. But you can't have a society without humanity being involved. The technicians and the technicalities, the science and the artificial intelligence, all of that needs to be for people, by people. In structuring a new economy, we could very easily structure a guaranteed annual income. We could very easily structure elimination of the debt for education and make it possible for everybody to have as much education as their minds can absorb. Those are things that would build a well-run society.
A well-run society, though, but you seem to be critical, Ambassador Young, of some of the protesters who recently were holding up signs, "No justice, no peace." You say you prefer the slogan, "No peace, no prosperity." But again, isn't justice a key cornerstone of peace? And for making sure that everyone does have these economic opportunities.
No justice, no prosperity. But it shouldn't be a threat. It should be a declaration of a fact. President Roosevelt understood that the Second World War was a result of not dealing with the economic questions of Europe after the First World War. So after the Second World War, we set up the United Nations. We set up the International Monetary Fund. We created a global economy that has done very, very well. We need to do that inside our nations, as well as internationally.
All right. Ambassador Young, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your wisdom. Thank you. Federal legislation proposed by Democrats to explore reparations stalled in the House last year, but some local efforts are already underway. I'm joined now by Representative Shirley Weber of the California State Assembly and leader of its legislative Black Caucus. Her legislation to establish a task force to study and explore recommendations for reparations was adopted in June. Assemblywoman Weber, your bill passed the state's assembly by a wide margin. Now it goes on to the California State Senate and then to the governor for approval. I presume you are confident the bill will become law. What then happens?
Well, once the bill is signed by the governor, then we're forming a task force of 8 individuals who have research and specialization in the issues of reparation and economic development. And they then will, once that task force is formed, no later than by June of next year, then we will have 1 year in which they are to do their work and research and to come up with recommendations by 2022 to talk about what we need to do to begin to repair the damage done to African American communities as a result of slavery in the United States overall, but also as a result of California's participation in the institution of slavery.
But at the end of the day, though, isn't it for the federal government to step in and have a comprehensive approach on this? If states like yours take measures at the local level, aren't you running the risk of fostering divisions rather than leading the way?
Well, it's very clear that it's going to be difficult to do anything at the federal level. That's been clear because the issue of reparations has been coming up every year for 20 years, and it has not been adopted. The division at the federal level is so great on every issue that it's almost impossible to get anything done. And so as a result, many of us are taking the lead in our own areas, our own cities, and California would be the first state to actually take the lead. California is the largest economic entity in the United States. We can show them how it can be done without basically creating such division and without breaking the bank. So we believe very strongly that California always leads in everything, whether it's judicial reform or social justice issues. And California can lead in this particular area as well.
But how practical is all of this? President Obama in 2016 said that he wasn't in favor of reparations because he said it was, quote, politically impractical. Was he right, or have things changed since then?
People said that the civil rights movement was impractical, that you could never actually affect the lives of individuals in terms of dealing with issues of race and opportunity. So we never believe in California that anything is impossible. It is all possible if we strongly believe that we have the resources and the opportunity to do it. California is the most diverse state in the nation and is grappling with not only African American issues, but other issues as well. And we see what's happening in the streets, that somehow or another pushing aside the issues that have divided individuals, pushing aside the issues that have created such unequal realities for individuals is not necessarily going to solve the problem by ignoring it. It will continue to rise, and until we address the critical issue of what has happened to African Americans in this country for 400 years that has left them behind in every area has to be adequately addressed.
But Assemblywoman, isn't this, though, an issue that still divides Americans? How important is it to have public opinion with you? Because just last year, a Gallup poll found that 67% of Americans, including 80% of Republicans, opposed the idea of reparations. Has public opinion changed in the wake of these protests that we've seen and those calls for racial justice?
It's no question that the death of Floyd in this country changed people's perception. People really realize now that the impact of discrimination and racism in this country has such a profound impact on the lives, not just of African Americans, but every American, that we could actually witness a man being murdered in front of us by a person who seems to have no remorse about it. That is a direct result of 400 years of enslavement and mistreatment and lynchings and burnings. And so we have to begin to address the issue of race in this country and the impact it's had, not only on African Americans, but on every aspect of American life. And if we don't address it, we will constantly find ourselves in this situation of protest.
All right, Assemblywoman Shirley Weber, great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Good to be here. Thank you very much.
As several cities across the U.S. consider reparations for descendants of slaves, there are calls for former colonial powers like France to make amends with the citizens of countries like Haiti, where Columbus established the first European settlement in the Americas. Haiti fought a 12-year war led by slaves and defeated Napoleon Bonaparte's forces, gaining independence from France in 1804. Haiti was the first independent nation from Latin America and the Caribbean, but it was forced to pay a crippling debt to France. Today, it is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, with a per capita income of $350, while France is one of the wealthiest nations in the world. We went to Port-au-Prince to meet an anti-corruption activist and economist who says it is time for France to pay back the $21 billion she says it extorted from her country.
This is very unfortunate that we didn't take advantage of Black Lives Matter and the discourse around reparation abroad to have a discussion about it in Haiti. But I think now the living conditions are so bad and people care more about what they're going to eat tomorrow. We are the one who suffered a crime against humanity when they took our freedom away. We are the one who had to pay a debt for gaining the freedom we deserve. Sean Mass is a reminder of how we need resources to develop this country. And this is where reparation comes. We became the first Black independent republic, the first one who got freedom from European colonizers in 1804. And after the independence, the slave owners, they refused to admit that the slave kicked them out of the countries. And France asked the Haitian government at the time to pay an indemnity to the colonizer, to the slave owners, because they lost their properties. And this was something that undermined Haitian economic development because France and the United States, they decided to put an embargo on Haiti, and we couldn't export our product because they didn't want other territory with slaves to do the same thing. So we had to develop a country from scratch, from nothing, from dust. It's really hard to imagine that people at that time had the nerve to ask us to pay a debt because they are the ones who suffered from slavery. They are the ones who lost everything. I don't think they will ever try to do any reparation, but we can still try and ask it. This is where it's complicated. I wouldn't be happy if they just take some money and give it to some corrupt officials that will use it for their own personal interests. Civil society needs to be involved. There needs to be a plan on what we're going to do with that money and how we're gonna make it meaningful. It's good to say you're sorry and apologize for what your ancestor did, but you benefit from it in financial terms, and it's only fair to provide financial resources to the people you exploited. It was extortion, and they need to send money back.
So will France pay reparations for what many would call extortion and exploitation? What changes can be made to the global economic system to heal the damages of racism and colonialism? Joining me now is Thomas Piketty, a French economist at the Paris School of Economics, who studies inequality. He's the author of the bestseller Capital in the 21st Century. His latest book is Capital and Ideology. Thomas Piketty, the case of Haiti is quite egregious. You described it as the most extreme injustice, and yet it is Haiti that paid reparations to France after it gained its freedom. Should France at least refund Haiti for this extortion in the very first instance and even go beyond that and pay compensation?
Yes, I think France, should compensate Haiti for this, incredible payment that Haiti had to make to France in order to stop being slave and in order to become free. This is the incredible story of the end of slavery in Haiti, but also the end of slavery pretty much everywhere in English colonies or in French colonies in the 19th century. The incredible story is that we actually paid slave owners, in order to compensate them for their loss of property. There was no compensation to slaves, for the very bad treatment and the decades of unpaid labor that they had gone through. But there was full compensation to slave owners. And in the case of Haiti, this was particularly enormous, and the payment continued, between 1825 and 1950. So when people say, this is too old, we cannot reopen this discussion, you have to be aware of the fact that there are many spoliation and loss of property which happened during World War II or even during World War I, which we are still discussing today.
As you say, it was 300% of the GDP, and Haitians spent 125 years repaying this quote-unquote debt. But as you also say, slave owners were also compensated in other French territories, and it wasn't just the French. The British did it too. They paid $120 billion to about 4,000 slave owners in 1833 when they abolished slavery. But you wrote recently that the issue of reparation for a past history involving slavery and colonization cannot be eluded forever, whether it's in the United States or in Europe. What makes you believe that it can no longer be avoided?
Well, it can no longer be avoided because you can see, the recent demonstration, with people from all origins, not only descendants of, African Americans or African Europeans, but also, people from purely European origins and from all origins, who don't want to see, in their street, in their cities, the statutes of merchant of slaves and people who became rich just through slave trade.
But looking at what former colonial powers can do, to date, the reality is that very few of them have apologized for or even accepted that colonialism was evil. You've studied the deep inequalities under colonial rule, which you say continue to this day. If it took so much for France to restitute to Algeria the skulls that were stored in the Museum of Natural History of some 50 Algerian freedom fighters decapitated in the 19th century, which it just did this month, what will it take for France to apologize and pay reparations, say, to Algeria, Vietnam, Cambodia? The list is really long. And of course, it applies to other colonial powers as well.
Yeah, it will take major mobilization. I think the young generation are maybe, more aware of this than, some of their, elder generation. Some of them took part to sometime to the colonial war of independence, or, sometimes, so maybe it's easier for the younger generation to look at this. But in any case, the issue is not going to go away.
But what you see today is that you still have the sequels of colonialism in so many African countries, in particular, the erosion of democracy, the rampant corruption that's sweeping through so many former colonies. Are we not seeing, in fact, a form of neo-colonialism today? When you think that a number of former French colonies, for example, are still using the French CFA currency, keeping their reserves with the French treasury, they're subsidizing the French economy, aren't they?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important, that the West African monetary union needs to be rebuilt on a completely different principle. So instead of having, free capital flow, so that the rich people from France or from West Africa can easily transfer their money between Paris and Bamako, they need to reconstruct their monetary union so as to favor investment in the young population of West Africa, which needs schools, which needs hospitals, which needs infrastructure, which needs basic income, especially with the pandemic today. So I think, the issue of how you organize a single currency and how you organize a monetary and economic union has to be rethought, in particular in West Africa.
You say to repair the damage that has been done by racism and colonization, essentially we must change the economic system to reduce these inequalities. Are you calling then for a new international economic order? Do you think the post-World War II Bretton Woods financial system has to be revamped?
Yeah, it has to be revamped in the sense that you cannot build, a fair economic system simply on the basis of free trade and free circulation of capital without any fiscal cooperation. I think we need some equitable tax system. We need to have some progressive tax system so that high-income individuals, high-wealth individuals, large corporations pay their fair share of the tax. And I think some of the tax paid by the most prosperous economic actors in the world should be used to finance, some universal right to basic services, for instance, in terms of health. We live today in a pandemic, and, every children in the world, every inhabitant of the world should have a right to a minimal level of health services. And I think this kind of approach based on right rather than based on aid, which in practice is always too small and is not used necessarily in the right manner. I think we have to have a right to each individual of the world to basic health and education services, which can be paid out of an equitable tax system, especially coming from the rich countries, prosperous actors.
A fairer world, a fairer system. Thomas Piketty, great to speak with you. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you.
And so while the Black Lives Matter momentum has helped drive these demands for reparations forward, it is still a road that is paved with uncertainty. While everyone agrees on the need to address racial inequality in theory, in practice it remains an issue that is fraught with political risk. The so-called great powers, whose greatness and riches are directly connected to plunder and exploitation, may be willing at long last to speak about their moral debt, however timidly, but they still resist the principle of paying compensation to the descendants and the victims themselves of the crimes of colonialism and slavery. From me, Rita Fakhri, and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.